The autumn sun hung low over the Nebraska prairie, casting long shadows across the weathered headstones of Bitter Creek Cemetery. The year was 1867, and the frontier town squatted like a collection of weathered wooden boxes on the edge of civilization, where the railroad met the cattle trails and hope collided with harsh reality. In this place, where dreams came to die, as often as they were born, a small figure knelt beside the freshest grave, her thin shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to echo across the endless grassland. 9-year-old Annie Mallory pressed her face against the rough wooden cross that marked her mother's final resting place, the splinters catching at her tear-stained cheeks. The fever had taken Margaret Mallory just 3 days ago, swift and merciless, as a prairie storm, leaving her daughter with nothing but memories and the bitter taste of abandonment. Annie's blue dress, once the color of summer sky, was now stained with mud, and grief, her small hands clutching a corn-husk doll, with button eyes, the last gift her mother had managed to make before the sickness claimed her. "Please don't be dead, Mama." Annie whispered, her voice barely audible above the dry rustling of grass. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do without you. Papa's been gone so long, and now you're gone too." The child's words were swallowed by the vast emptiness of the prairie, where the wind carried dust and sorrow in equal measure. She had no family left, no relatives to claim her, no prospects in a town that regarded orphans as burdens to be shuffled between reluctant households until they were old enough to work or wise enough to disappear. The townspeople had attended her mother's funeral with the appropriate solemnity, then returned to their own concerns, leaving Annie to face her grief alone. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up through tear-blurred eyes, her heart hammering with sudden fear. A tall shadow fell across the grave, and Annie's breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure standing over her. The man was Lakota. She could tell from his buckskin clothing, the intricate beadwork on his shirt, and the single eagle feather that hung from his long black hair. He was perhaps 40 years old, with deep lines around his dark eyes and a weathered face that spoke of countless seasons on the open plains. Chief Chaska Redhawk had ridden 23 miles to reach this place, carrying wildflowers picked from the prairie, where he had once hunted with the man buried beneath the simple wooden cross next to Annie's mother. The sight of the child kneeling in the dirt brought back memories that cut through him like a blade, his own daughter, Little Star, who would have been about this age now if she had lived. He could still remember her laugh, bright as birdsong, and the way she would run to greet him when he returned from hunting. But Little Star was gone, along with his wife Ayanna, both cut down in their sleep by cavalry sabers 2 years ago. The pain was fresh again, seeing this grieving child alone in the world, as his own daughter had been alone in those final moments. Chaska's hands trembled slightly as he knelt beside John Mallory's grave, arranging the wildflowers on the settled earth. The memory was crystal clear in his mind. The ambush near the Platte River 3 years ago, the bullet that had torn through his side, the cavalry patrol that had left him for dead in the tall grass. John Mallory had found him there, bleeding and alone, and instead of claiming the bounty some territories paid for Lakota scalps, he had bandaged the wound and helped him reach safety. "A man's a man," John had said in his quiet way, his hands steady as he worked to stop the bleeding. "Don't matter what color his skin is or what language he speaks. We all bleed the same red, and we all deserve a chance to see another sunrise." That act of mercy had grown into something precious and rare, a friendship that crossed the bitter divide between their peoples. John would sometimes ride out to the edge of the prairie to trade with Chaska's band, bringing coffee and sugar in exchange for buffalo hides and beadwork. They would sit by the fire and talk about their children, their hopes, their fears for the future, that seemed to grow more uncertain with each passing season. Annie watched the Lakota man with a mixture of terror and fascination. She had been taught that Indians were dangerous, that they would scalp children and carry them off to lives of slavery and terror. But there was something in this man's expression, that she recognized something that spoke to the hollow ache in her own chest. He was grieving too, mourning someone he had cared about. His dark eyes held the same emptiness she felt inside, the same weight of loss that made it hard to breathe sometimes. "Did you know my papa?" Annie asked in a small voice, her curiosity overcoming her fear. Chaska looked at her for a long moment, seeing so much of his own lost daughter in her frightened eyes. "John Mallory was a good man," he said finally, his voice gentle as summer rain. "He saved my life once, when others would have left me to die." "He's dead," Annie said with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when stating terrible truths. "Mama said he drank too much whiskey and his heart gave out. But I heard Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson whispering after the funeral. They said things that didn't make sense." "What kind of things?" Chaska asked, though he suspected he already knew. That he was asking too many questions about what happened to the Indian villages. That he was getting too friendly with your people. That maybe someone wanted him to stop talking. Annie's voice dropped to a whisper. "Mrs. Patterson said maybe it wasn't the whiskey that killed him at all." Before Chaska could respond, and the sound of boots on gravel announced the arrival of unwelcome visitors. Sheriff Wade Holcomb approached the cemetery with 5 of his men, and their weapons drawn, their faces set, with the kind of righteous anger that justified any action. Holcomb was a man who had built his reputation on being tough with troublemakers, and in his mind, any Indian who dared enter Bitter Creek was trouble by definition. The sheriff was younger than Chaska, perhaps 35, with the kind of military bearing that spoke of cavalry training and frontier violence. He wore his past like a badge of honor, along with the small crimson star pin on his coat lapel. A decoration he claimed came from his commanding officer for distinguished service during the Indian Wars. The pin caught the afternoon sunlight, gleaming like a drop of blood against his dark coat. "You're trespassing on holy ground, Redskin." Holcomb called out his voice, carrying the authority of badge and gun. "This is a Christian cemetery, not a place for your heathen rituals." Chaska rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. The sheriff's blood-hued badge triggered a memory that flickered at the edge of his consciousness, a flash of red in the dawn light, the screams of women and children, the smell of burning lodges. But the memory was incomplete, fragmented by trauma and time. "I come in peace." Chaska said, his voice steady despite the danger. "I honor the memory of John Mallory, who was my friend." John Mallory had no Indian friends. Holcomb snapped, his pale eyes cold as winter ice. He was a God-fearing American who died because he couldn't handle his liquor. Now step away from that grave before I put you in one next to it. Annie looked back and forth between the 2 men, sensing the violence that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. She had seen this before, men getting ready to hurt each other, the same look in their eyes that she had glimpsed on the night her father died. Without fully understanding why, she moved closer to the Lakota man, her instincts telling her that he was the safer choice. "The child stays with me," Chaska said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Like hell she does," Holcomb replied, raising his pistol. The metal gleamed dully in the afternoon light. "Boys, we've got ourselves a kidnapping in progress." The other men spread out behind him, their weapons ready. Deputy Tom Fletcher, a nervous young man who had always harbored doubts about his superior's methods, shifted uncomfortably as he aimed his rifle. Jim Morrison, the town blacksmith, gripped his shotgun with white knuckles. 3 other townsmen, whose names Chaska didn't know, completed the semicircle of armed men. Dark clouds had been gathering on the horizon all afternoon, and now the first drops of rain began to fall. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming storm and the distant rumble of thunder. In the space of heartbeats, the autumn afternoon transformed into something wild and dangerous. "Last warning, Indian," Holcomb shouted over the rising wind. "Walk away now, or we'll drag your body away." Chaska didn't move. He stood protectively in front of Annie, who had pressed herself against his legs in terror. The child's thin body shook with cold and fear, but she didn't run. Perhaps she understood in the way children sometimes do that running would only make things worse. She's just a child. Chaska said his words carrying clearly despite the storm. I knew her father. John Mallory saved my life once, and I promised myself I would repay that debt. You're a liar. Holcomb snarled, but something flickered in his eyes, guilt perhaps, or fear. John Mallory was a drunk who couldn't tell a redskin from a rattlesnake. He got what he deserved. The words hung in the air like a confession, and Chaska felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the rain. The sheriff's casual dismissal of John's death, the way he spoke of it as deserved, it confirmed what Chaska had long suspected. John Mallory hadn't died from drinking. Thunder crashed overhead, and the rain began to fall in earnest, transforming the cemetery into a battlefield of mud and chaos. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark white flashes that made everyone look like ghosts. The wooden crosses and headstones seemed to swim in the downpour, creating a surreal landscape where the living and the dead were separated by nothing more than a few feet of rain-soaked earth. Holcomb's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the storm unleashed its full fury. A wall of wind and rain swept across the cemetery with the force of a freight train, sending hats flying and forcing the men to stagger backward. The rain fell so hard it was like standing under a waterfall, and the wind howled like a thing in pain. In the chaos, Chaska made his choice. He scooped Annie into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. The child clung to him desperately, her small arms around his neck, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Hold tight, he whispered in her ear, then turned toward the edge of the cemetery where his horse waited. Stop! Holcomb's voice was nearly lost in the wind, but Chaska heard the shot that followed. The bullet whined past his ear so close he felt the heat of its passage. More shots followed, muzzle flashes lighting up the gloom like fireflies, but the downpour made accurate shooting impossible. They reached Chaska's horse, a sturdy pinto mare that had carried him through countless dangers. With one fluid motion, he lifted Annie onto the saddle and swung up behind her, his wet buckskin heavy and cold against his skin. The horse danced nervously, eager to escape the noise and confusion. Where are we going? Annie asked, her voice small and frightened above the storm. Away from here, Chaska replied, nudging the horse into motion. Away from men who would hurt you. They rode out of the cemetery at a gallop, the storm providing cover as they disappeared into the vast expanse of the prairie. Behind them, Sheriff Holcomb's curses were lost in the wind, but his rage was palpable. The sheriff's face was the last thing Chaska saw before the rain swallowed them, twisted with fury. And something else, a fear that seemed to go deeper than anger over a single escaped Indian. As they rode through the storm, Annie pressed her face against Chaska's chest, finding what comfort she could in his warmth and the steady beat of his heart. The world had become a place of violence and uncertainty. But somehow she felt safer with this stranger than she had in the town where she was born. Are you really going to hurt me? She asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. No, Chaska said firmly. I'm going to protect you. That's what your father would have wanted. How do you know what Papa would have wanted? Because good men want the same things, Chaska replied. They want their children to be safe and happy. They want them to grow up in a world where people help each other instead of hurting each other. The abandoned homestead appeared through the storm like a mirage, its weathered walls and partially collapsed roof offering the first shelter they had seen in hours. Tuesday morning's storm had been fierce, and they had ridden hard through the night, the horse picking her way carefully across the rain-slicked prairie, while lightning provided brief, harsh illumination of their surroundings. Is this where we're going to live now? Annie asked as Chaska helped her down from the horse. Her voice was hoarse from exhaustion and fear, and she moved like an old woman, her limbs stiff from hours in the saddle. Just for today. Chaska replied, though he wasn't sure how long they would be able to stay ahead of the posse he knew would be coming. We need to get you warm and dry. The inside of the homestead was in better condition than the exterior suggested. The previous owners had built well with thick walls and a stone fireplace that had survived the years of abandonment. Chaska quickly gathered dry wood from a pile beside the hearth, grateful that some earlier traveler had been thoughtful enough to leave fuel for the next person in need. As he worked to build a fire, Annie explored the small space with the curiosity of a child. The homestead consisted of a single room with a sleeping loft, furnished with a rough table and 2 chairs that the previous owners had left behind. Gaps in the walls let in drafts, and the floor was covered with a layer of dust and debris. But it was shelter from the storm and the men who would be hunting them. My papa used to tell me stories about places like this, Annie said, running her finger along the dusty tabletop. He said people came west to build new lives, but sometimes the land was too hard and they had to give up their dreams. What else did your papa tell you? Chaska asked as he coaxed the fire to life, watching the flames dance and grow. That the most important thing a person can do is help somebody else when they need it, even if it's dangerous. She looked at him with eyes that seemed too old for her face. He said that's what makes us human, instead of just animals fighting over territory. He said that's why he helped wounded soldiers even when they were fighting against his friends. Your father was a wise man, Chaska said, feeling the warmth of the fire begin to drive away the chill. He lived by those words. That's why he saved my life. What do your people believe about helping others? Annie asked, settling closer to the fire. We believe that all things are connected, Chaska said, surprised by her interest. The buffalo, the grass, the wind, the people, we are all part of the same spirit. When you help someone, you help yourself. When you hurt someone, you hurt yourself too. Do you have children? Annie asked suddenly. The question hit Chaska like a physical blow. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. I had a daughter once, he said finally. Her name was Little Star. She would have been about your age now. What happened to her? She died in a cavalry attack on our village. Her and her mother both. The words came out flat and emotionless, but Annie could hear the pain underneath. I'm sorry, she said softly. That must hurt really bad. It does, Chaska admitted. But seeing you reminds me of her. She was curious, like you, always asking questions about everything. The fire caught fully, sending warm light dancing across the walls. Annie moved closer to the flames, holding her hands out to warm them. Her dress was still damp from the rain, and Chaska could see that she was shivering despite the growing warmth. Are you hungry? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Annie nodded, though she seemed almost embarrassed to admit it. I haven't had anything since yesterday morning. Mrs. Patterson was supposed to bring me something after the funeral, but she never came. I think people are scared to help me now. Why would they be scared? Because of what Mrs. Henderson said. She said maybe Papa was killed because he was too friendly with Indians, and maybe the same thing would happen to anyone who helped me. Chaska felt a surge of anger at the townspeople who had abandoned this child in her time of need. He had some dried meat in his saddlebags, but it wouldn't be enough to sustain her for long. They would need to find more food, and that meant taking risks. I'll find us something to eat, he said, checking his knife and the small tomahawk he carried. You stay here by the fire and try to get warm. Can you do that for me? You're not leaving me forever, are you? Panic flashed in Annie's eyes. You're not going to ride away and never come back? No, Chaska said firmly, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. I'm not going to leave you. I promised your father I would take care of you, and I keep my promises. But I need to get food, and it's safer if you stay here. Annie nodded reluctantly, though he could see the fear in her expression. She settled down beside the fire, wrapping her arms around her knees, and watched as he prepared to leave. The trust she placed in him was both humbling and terrifying. He was responsible for this child now, and failure would mean her death. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean and gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Chaska mounted his horse and rode toward the cluster of farm buildings he had spotted from the ridge above the homestead. The Hendricks place, if he remembered correctly from his conversations with John, a family of German immigrants who raised cattle and grew corn in the river bottom. As he approached the farm, Chaska could see smoke rising from the chimney and cattle grazing in the pasture. This was exactly the kind of place where an Indian would be shot on sight, but Annie needed food and he was running out of options. He dismounted near the barn and made his way carefully toward the cluster of outbuildings, staying in the shadows and moving as silently as his moccasins would allow. The barn was filled with the rich smells of hay and livestock, and Chaska could hear the gentle lowing of cattle in the nearby pasture. He found what he was looking for in the tack room, a cloth sack containing bread, cheese, and dried apples that someone had left for a midday meal. It wasn't much, but it would keep Annie fed for another day or two. As he turned to leave, a voice called out behind him, "Hold it right there, you thieving redskin." Chaska spun around to see a young farmhand standing in the doorway, a shotgun leveled at his chest. The boy couldn't have been more than 17 with the pale skin and light hair of his German heritage. But his hands were steady, and his eyes were hard with the kind of hatred that was taught rather than born. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Chaska said, raising his hand slowly. "I just need food for a hungry child." "The only child you're feeding is the devil himself." The farmhand snarled. "Mr. Hendricks told us to watch for Indians after what happened in town. Said you kidnapped a white girl and probably scalped her by now." "The girl is safe," Chaska replied, keeping his voice calm and reasonable. "Her name is Annie Mallory, and she's the daughter of John Mallory, who died 2 years ago. I'm protecting her from men who would harm her." "You're lying," the farmhand said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Indians don't protect white children. They kill them." "Some do," Chaska admitted. "Just as some white men kill Indian children. But not all of us are the same, any more than all of you are the same." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the space of the barn, the tension thick enough to cut. Then the farmhand's finger tightened on the trigger, and Chaska threw himself to the side, just as the shotgun roared. The blast echoed through the barn like thunder, and Chaska felt the heat of the pellets as they whistled past his shoulder. A long splinter of wood from the barn wall tore through his left arm, leaving a gash that immediately began to bleed. He rolled behind a pile of hay bales, his heart pounding as he heard the farmhand trying to reload. The wound on his arm burned like fire, and he could feel warm blood seeping through his buckskin shirt. It wasn't deep enough to be dangerous, but it would slow him down and make fighting more difficult. He had seconds before the next shot, and Annie was depending on him to return with food. Chaska drew his knife and waited for the right moment. When the farmhand stepped around the hay bales, shotgun raised, Chaska struck like a coiled snake. He knocked the weapon aside with his right hand, while bringing the knife up with his left, the blade stopping just short of the young man's throat. "I don't want to hurt you." Chaska said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins and the throbbing pain in his arm. "But I will, if you force me to." The farmhand stared at him with wide eyes, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "You're going to kill me," he whispered. "No," Chaska said, stepping back and sheathing his knife. "I'm going to take this food and leave. If you're smart, you'll tell your boss that you never saw me." He picked up the sack of food and headed for the door, his back tingling with the expectation of another shot. But the farmhand remained frozen where he stood, perhaps finally understanding that the savage he had been taught to fear was more merciful than the men who had taught him to hate. The ride back to the homestead seemed longer than before, every shadow potentially hiding an ambush. Chaska's arm throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel blood seeping through his shirt. The encounter had cost him precious time and revealed his position to potential enemies, but Annie would eat tonight, and that was what mattered. When he reached the abandoned homestead, he found Annie huddled beside the dying fire, her eyes wide with worry. She jumped up when she saw him, relief flooding her face like sunrise after a long night. "I thought you weren't coming back," she said, trying to hide the tears in her voice. "I heard a gunshot, and I thought maybe they caught you." "I told you I wouldn't leave you," Chaska replied, dismounting and securing his horse. "And I brought food just like I promised." He shared the bread and cheese with her, watching as she ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had known too much loss. As Annie ate, she noticed the blood on his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Let me help." She tore strips of cloth from her petticoat and helped him bind the wound, her small hands surprisingly gentle and skilled. "Mama taught me about doctoring," she explained. "She said sometimes knowing how to help people is more important than knowing how to hurt them." "Your mama was a wise woman," Chaska said, touched by the child's compassion. "Tell me about your wife," Annie said as they settled beside the fire. "What was she like?" Chaska leaned back against the wall and gathered his thoughts. "Her name was Ayana, which means eternal blossom in our language. She was beautiful with long black hair that caught the sunlight like water. She had the gentlest hands, and she could make the most beautiful beadwork you've ever seen." "Did she make that shirt you're wearing?" "Yes," Chaska said, looking down at the intricate patterns on his buckskin. "She worked on it for months, sewing each bead by hand. She said it would protect me when I was away from home." "Tell me about your daughter, too." "Little Star was curious about everything just like you. She would follow me around camp, asking questions about the horses, the weapons, the hunting trips. She wanted to know why the sky was blue and why the grass was green and why the buffalo traveled in herds." Annie was quiet for a moment, absorbing the stories. "Do you think they would have liked me?" "I think they would have loved you," Chaska said honestly. "Ayana always said that children were gifts from the Great Spirit, no matter where they came from." As night fell over the prairie, Chaska kept watch at the window, while Annie slept wrapped in his blanket. The stars were coming out cold and distant in the clear sky, and somewhere in the darkness, he could hear the howl of a coyote calling to its pack. The sound reminded him of his own people, scattered and hunted, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. But tonight, he had saved one child from that destruction. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but for now, that was enough. Wednesday morning brought no relief from their troubles. Chaska woke before dawn to the sound of dogs barking in the distance, and he knew immediately what it meant. Sheriff Holcomb had organized a posse, and they were using tracking dogs to follow the scent trail. The storm had washed away most of their tracks, but dogs could follow a scent for miles, and they would lead the hunters straight to the homestead. "We have to go," he told Annie, who was still wrapped in his blanket beside the cold ashes of their fire. "The sheriff is coming." Annie sat up quickly, her hair tangled and her dress wrinkled from sleeping on the hard floor. "How do you know?" "I can hear the dogs," Chaska said, gathering his few possessions and checking his weapons. "They're following our scent from yesterday. We have maybe an hour before they reach us." The child stood and folded the blanket carefully before handing it back to him. Despite her fear, she moved with quiet efficiency, having learned in her short life to pack quickly and travel light. "Where will we go now?" "There's a place I know," Chaska said, though he wasn't sure the hiding spot he had in mind would be safe for a child. "But we'll have to move fast, and it won't be easy." They left the homestead within minutes, riding hard across the open grassland toward a line of red sandstone bluffs that rose from the prairie like the backbone of some enormous buried creature. The morning sun was already climbing, but a thick fog had rolled in from the river, creating an eerie gray landscape where visibility was limited to just a few dozen yards. The sound of pursuit grew louder as they rode, and Chaska could make out the baying of hounds through the mist. Sheriff Holcomb was taking no chances with his hunt, and the dogs running ahead of the horses would make it impossible to throw them off the trail by crossing water or doubling back. "I can't see anything." Annie said, her voice tight with fear as they rode through the fog. "Are they going to catch us?" "Not if I can help it," Chaska replied, though he knew the odds were against them. His wounded arm ached with each movement, and the fog that hid them from their pursuers also made it difficult for him to navigate. The hiding place Chaska had in mind was a deep cave system that tunneled into the bluffs, accessible only through a narrow opening that was barely wide enough for a horse and rider. He had discovered it years ago during a buffalo hunt, and it had served as a refuge more than once when cavalry patrols had gotten too close to his village. But as they approached the bluffs, the fog began to lift, revealing their position to the pursuing posse. Chaska could see the riders now, at least 8 men with their weapons ready, closing the distance rapidly. His horse was tired from the hard ride, and Annie's extra weight was slowing them down. "Now hold on tight," he told Annie as they reached the cave entrance. "We're going to have to climb." The cave mouth was 20 feet up the cliff face, accessible only by a narrow ledge that zigzagged up the sandstone wall. Chaska dismounted and helped Annie down, and then led his horse into a thick grove of cottonwoods where it would be hidden from the posse. "I can't climb that," Annie said, her voice shaking as she looked up at the dizzying height. "I'm too scared." "Yes, you can," Chaska said firmly, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. "Your father was brave, and so are you. I'll be right beside you every step of the way." The climb was treacherous, made worse by the loose rock and the morning mist that made the stone slippery. Chaska went first, testing each handhold and foothold before allowing Annie to follow. His wounded arm protested with each movement, sending spikes of pain through his shoulder, but he forced himself to keep going. Halfway up the cliff face, disaster struck. A section of the ledge crumbled under Annie's weight, sending her sliding toward the edge with a scream of terror. Chaska lunged forward his injured arm, screaming in protest as he grabbed her wrist and hauled her back to safety. "I've got you," he said, his own heart pounding as he looked down at the rocks far below. "You're safe." But the effort had cost him dearly. The wound on his arm had torn open again, and he could feel warm blood soaking through his shirt. The pain was intense, making his vision blur and his grip uncertain. Below them, the posse had reached the base of the cliff and was spreading out, looking for a way to follow. "There," Sheriff Holcomb's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "They're up on the ledge. Get the rifles." Shots rang out bullets, chipping stone fragments from the cliff face around them. The reports echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and Chaska felt the sting of rock splinters against his back as he sheltered Annie with his body. They were sitting ducks on the open ledge with nowhere to go but up. "Can you keep climbing?" he asked Annie, though he wasn't sure he could manage it himself. She nodded, though her face was pale with fear. "I think so. But what about your arm?" "Don't worry about me," Chaska said, though the wound was getting worse with each movement. "Just focus on the climb." They resumed their ascent, moving as quickly as safety allowed while bullets whistled past them. One shot came so close that Chaska felt the bullet part his hair, and another chipped stone just inches from Annie's hand. The pain in his arm was like fire now, making it difficult to concentrate on finding handholds. At the cave entrance, they found blessed relief from the gunfire. The opening was narrow and well hidden, invisible from below unless you knew exactly where to look. Chaska helped Annie inside, then collapsed against the cave wall, his strength finally giving out. "I need to rest," he said, his breathing labored. The blood loss was making him dizzy, and he could feel his strength fading fast. Annie looked at his arm with eyes that had seen too much suffering for her age. "You're hurt really bad," she said. "Let me help." She tore more strips from her dress and helped him bind the wound, her small hands surprisingly gentle and skilled. "My mama showed me how to clean wounds and stop bleeding," she explained. "She said it was important for girls to know these things. Your mama was very wise." Chaska said, grateful for the child's care. The cave was deep and cool with passages that twisted back into the heart of the bluff. Chaska had explored it before and knew it had multiple exits, but he also knew they would be trapped if the posse found another way up. "Are we safe now?" Annie asked, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. "For now," Chaska replied, though he could hear the men below, still searching for a way to reach them. "But we can't stay here forever." As they rested in the cave, Annie asked more questions about Lakota culture. "What games do Indian children play?" she asked. "We play many games," Chaska said, grateful for the distraction from his pain. "There's a game with sticks and hoops where you try to throw the stick through the hoop while it's rolling. And we play a game where you try to catch arrows in flight." "That sounds dangerous." "It teaches you to be quick and to pay attention," Chaska explained. "These skills can save your life when you're hunting or fighting." "Could you teach me some of these games? If we get out of this alive, I'll teach you whatever you want to know," Chaska promised. Outside the cave, they could hear the posse still searching, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. Sheriff Holcomb was shouting orders, his frustration clear even through the stone. But as the hours passed, the sounds began to fade as the men gave up their search and moved on. As evening approached, Chaska began to feel feverish. The wound on his arm was infected, and red streaks were spreading up toward his shoulder. He knew he needed medical attention, but getting it would mean exposing himself and Annie to danger. "You don't look good," Annie said, pressing her small hand to his forehead. "You're burning up." "I'll be fine," Chaska said, though they both knew he was getting worse. "Just need to rest." But rest was a luxury they couldn't afford. Even as his fever climbed, Chaska could hear Annie beginning to mumble in her sleep, her own temperature rising as exhaustion and stress took their toll. By Thursday morning, both of them were sick, Chaska with infection and Annie with a fever that made her delirious. "Papa," Annie whispered in her delirium, her eyes closed, her voice thick with fever. "Papa, don't let the red man hurt you." Chaska listened more carefully as she continued to mumble, trying to make sense of her fevered words. Sometimes children remembered things they weren't supposed to know, details that adults thought they were too young to understand. "The red star," Annie said suddenly, her voice clearer for a moment. "The red star is scary. It hurt, Papa." Chaska's blood ran cold despite his fever. He looked down at the child, but her eyes were still closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. "What red star, Annie?" "The bad man with the red star." She continued, her voice fading in and out like a distant echo. "He came to our house when I was supposed to be sleeping. They had a big fight. I hid behind the curtain and listened." The words hit Chaska like a physical blow. The red star pin on Sheriff Holcomb's coat, he had seen it before, not on a sheriff's uniform, but on a cavalry officer's coat. The memory was becoming clearer, now sharpened by Annie's words. Papa said he wouldn't help them hurt the Indian people anymore. Annie continued in her feverish state. "He said what they did to the village was wrong, that women and children didn't deserve to die." The bad man got really angry. Chaska's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. The red star pin wasn't just a decoration, it was a mark of identity, a way for members of a secret group to recognize each other. The officer who had led the dawn attack on his village 2 years ago had worn the same pin, and now Sheriff Holcomb wore it too. Star on his coat. Annie whispered, her small voice carrying clearly in the cave. "Red like blood. Papa told him to get out of our house. Said he wouldn't help cover up the massacre anymore. The bad man said Papa would be sorry that accidents happen to people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut." The revelation struck Chaska like lightning. The officer who had massacred his village, who had murdered his wife and daughter in cold blood, was the same man who now wore a sheriff's badge in Bitter Creek. Wade Holcomb had been using his position to cover up his crimes, eliminating anyone who threatened to expose the truth about his past. "You killed my papa," Annie said in her fevered state, her small voice carrying a conviction that chilled Chaska to the bone. "The man with the red star killed my papa." As Annie's fever broke on Friday morning, Chaska made a decision that would change everything. Despite his own weakened condition, he knew he had to get her to a doctor. The irony was bitter. To save John Mallory's daughter, he would have to return to the town where her father's killer waited with a gun and a badge. The ride back to Bitter Creek was a nightmare of pain and determination. Chaska's arm was badly infected, and fever made his vision swim, but he kept riding, driven by fury and love in equal measure. Annie was still weak from her ordeal, but she was lucid now, her fever having broken during the night. "Are we going back to town?" she asked as they approached the outskirts of Bitter Creek. "Yes," Chaska said. "You need a doctor, and I need to finish what your father started." "Are you going to tell everyone what I remembered?" "Yes," Chaska said firmly. "The truth needs to be told." As they rode down the main street of Bitter Creek, people stopped and stared. The sight of the wounded Lakota chief carrying the white child was enough to draw a crowd, and within minutes, a substantial group had gathered around the sheriff's office. Sheriff Holcomb emerged from the building, his hand resting on his gun and the crimson star pin catching the afternoon sunlight. Well, he said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. "The savage returns, and he's brought his little prize with him." Chaska dismounted slowly, his legs shaking with exhaustion and blood loss. He helped Annie down from the horse, and she stood beside him, her young face set with determination. "She needs a doctor," Chaska said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "She's been through enough. The only thing she needs is to be away from you." Holcomb replied, his pale eyes cold with hatred. "You kidnapped her, terrorized her, probably did unspeakable things to her." "No," Chaska said, straightening despite the pain in his arm. "I protected her. From you." Holcomb's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I know who you really are," Chaska said, his voice growing stronger as anger burned away his exhaustion. "I know about the blood-hued badge you wear, and I know what you did to earn it." For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across Holcomb's face. Then his expression hardened again, and his hand moved closer to his gun. "You're talking nonsense. Heat stroke, probably. Common among your kind. 2 years ago, you led a cavalry unit against my village." Chaska continued his words, carrying clearly to the gathered crowd. "You killed my wife and daughter while they slept. You burned our lodges and scattered our horses. And when John Mallory found out what you had done, you killed him too." The crowd stirred uneasily, some of them beginning to look at their sheriff with new eyes. But Holcomb's face had gone pale, and his voice remained steady. "You're lying. John Mallory was a drunk who died of his own weakness. He was a man who stood up for what was right," Chaska said. "And you murdered him for it." "Prove it," Holcomb snarled. "You've got nothing but the word of a savage against a sworn officer of the law." That's when Annie stepped forward, her young voice clear and strong. "I can prove it," she said. "I remember everything now." Holcomb's face went white as the child began to speak her words, carrying clearly in the hushed street. "You came to our house late at night. You and Papa had a big fight. I hid behind the curtain and listened to everything." "She's delirious," Holcomb said desperately. "The fever is making her say things." But Annie was growing stronger with each word. "You said Papa was causing trouble by asking questions about what happened to the Indian village. You said he needed to keep his mouth shut about the massacre or something bad would happen to him." The crowd was murmuring now, some of them beginning to back away from their sheriff. An old prospector named Ezra Williamson, who had been John Mallory's closest friend, stepped forward from the crowd. "I remember that night, too," Williamson said, his weathered face grim. "I saw you leaving John's place real late, Holcomb. He was alive when you got there, dead when folks found him the next morning." "You're all lying," Holcomb screamed, his composure finally cracking. "This Indian has poisoned your minds against me." But the truth was out now, and there was no stopping it. Annie continued her testimony, describing details that only someone who had witnessed the confrontation could know. She told them about the threats, about how Holcomb had described the massacre as necessary and justified. "You killed my papa because he wouldn't help you cover up what you did to the Indian people," Annie said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You killed him because he was trying to do the right thing." The crowd was turning now, and their faces hardening with anger and disgust. But Holcomb wasn't finished. As his support crumbled, he made a desperate play for control. He signaled to 3 of his men positioned at the edge of the gathering, and they raised their rifles. "You're all going to go home now," Holcomb said, his voice carrying a new edge of menace. "And you're going to forget what you heard here today. This Indian is going to hang for his crimes, and anyone who tries to stop it will join him." The crowd began to back away, fear overcoming their momentary courage. But Ezra Williamson stood his ground, his old hand steady despite his age. "I've been quiet for 2 years," he said. "I ain't being quiet anymore." "Then you'll die with your Indian friend," Holcomb replied, nodding to his men. The rifles swung toward Williamson, but before they could fire, chaos erupted. Someone in the crowd, a young woman whose brother had died in the Indian Wars, bumped into one of Holcomb's men, throwing off his aim. The shot went wide, shattering a window in the general store and sending glass cascading onto the wooden sidewalk. In the confusion, someone knocked over a lantern, and within moments, flames were racing through the dry wooden buildings of Bitter Creek. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. The autumn had been dry, and the wooden structures were like kindling, waiting for a spark. "Everyone get to the graveyard," someone shouted. "It's the only open space." But Sheriff Holcomb had other plans. In the chaos of the fire, he saw his chance for revenge. If he couldn't silence his accusers with authority, he would silence them with violence. His gun was in his hand now, the metal gleaming in the firelight. "You're all going to die," he screamed, his voice barely audible over the crackling of burning wood. "And when they find your bodies, I'll tell them you started the fire." The first shot went wide, deflected by the thick smoke that was filling the street. Chaska pulled Annie close, sheltering her body with his own, as bullets whined through the air around them. The sound of each shot was like thunder in his ears, and he could feel the heat of the flames on his face. "We have to get to the graveyard," Chaska shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "It's the only safe place." They ran through the burning street, dodging falling timbers and jumping over pools of flame. Chaska's wounded arm screamed in protest with each step, but adrenaline drove him forward. Behind them, he could hear Holcomb's voice rising above the chaos, still screaming threats and accusations. The graveyard, where everything had begun, was now their only sanctuary. The open space between the headstones offered some protection from the flames, though sparks and burning debris rained down like hellish snow. Chaska led Annie to her mother's grave, the same spot where he had first found her crying just days ago. "Stay behind the headstone," he told her. "No matter what happens, stay low and keep the stone between you and the fire. Don't leave me." Annie pleaded, her small hands clutching at his shirt. "I'm not leaving," he said gently. "But I have to finish this. Your father deserves justice." Holcomb emerged from the wall of flame like a demon from hell, his clothes singed and his face blackened with soot. The crimson star pin on his coat was tarnished, now stained with ash and smoke. In his hand was a pistol, its barrel gleaming in the firelight. "It ends here, Indian." He snarled, his voice raw from the smoke. "Right where it started." The two men faced each other across the narrow space between the graves, the same graves that had brought them together in the first place. John Mallory's headstone stood between them, a wooden cross that cast a flickering shadow in the dancing light of the flames. "Yes," Chaska said quietly, drawing his knife and tomahawk. "It ends here." Holcomb raised his pistol and fired. The bullet whistled past Chaska's ear so close he felt the heat of its passage, and heard the sharp crack as it splintered the wooden cross behind him. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, leaving his ears ringing. Chaska threw himself to the side, rolling behind a large granite headstone as Holcomb fired again. This bullet chipped stone fragments from the marker, sending sharp splinters flying. One piece grazed Chaska's cheek, drawing blood, but he ignored the sting and kept moving. The sheriff fired a third time, and this shot came even closer. Chaska felt the bullet tear through his shirt, leaving a burning line across his ribs. The pain was sharp and immediate, but not deep enough to be fatal. He could feel warm blood beginning to seep through his shirt, adding to the blood already staining his wounded arm. "You killed my family," Chaska shouted from behind the headstone, his voice carrying clearly despite the roar of the flames. "You killed my friend, and you would have killed his daughter. They were all in my way." Holcomb screamed back, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. "Indian settlers, anyone who tried to stop progress, this is white man's land now." The sheriff's gun clicked empty, and he began fumbling for fresh ammunition. His hands were shaking with rage and fear made worse by the smoke and heat. Chaska saw his chance and charged, his weapons gleaming in the firelight. The two men collided between the graves with bone-jarring force. Holcomb was younger and heavier, but Chaska had experience and righteous fury on his side. They crashed into John Mallory's headstone, the wooden cross splintering under their combined weight. Holcomb threw a savage punch that caught Chaska in the stomach, driving the air from his lungs. The sheriff followed up with an uppercut that snapped Chaska's head back, sending stars exploding across his vision. But Chaska fought through the pain, driving his knee up into Holcomb's ribs, with a crack that could be heard even over the roar of the flames. The sheriff gasped and staggered backward, but he wasn't finished. He grabbed a chunk of broken headstone and swung it at Chaska's head. The Lakota warrior ducked, and the stone whistled past his ear to shatter against another grave marker. Chaska lashed out with his knife, the blade slicing across Holcomb's arm and drawing a line of blood. The sheriff cursed and stumbled backward directly into the path of a shower of sparks from a burning building. His shirt began to smolder, and he had to slap at the flames to keep from catching fire. "You can't win." Holcomb gasped as they circled each other warily. "Even if you kill me, they'll never accept you. You're still just a savage to them." "Or maybe." Chaska replied, his breathing labored, but his grip on his weapon steady. "But I'm a savage who keeps his promises to his friends." The sheriff's military training showed as he feinted with his left hand and then drove his right fist into Chaska's wounded arm. The pain was excruciating, like lightning shooting through his entire body. His vision blurred, and he nearly dropped his knife as weakness flooded through him. Holcomb pressed his advantage, grabbing Chaska by the throat and squeezing. The sheriff's fingers dug into his windpipe, cutting off his air. Black spots began to dance at the edges of Chaska's vision, and he could feel his strength ebbing away. But then he heard Annie's voice cutting through the chaos. "Papa, behind you." Chaska didn't know if she was calling to him or to the memory of her father, but the sound gave him strength. He brought his tomahawk up in a short, vicious arc that caught Holcomb in the side. The sheriff screamed, and released his grip, staggering backward with blood streaming from the wound. The distraction was enough. Holcomb broke away and scrambled toward his dropped pistol, his hands shaking as he tried to reload. The flames were getting closer now, surrounding the graveyard with walls of fire that seemed to reach toward the sky. The heat was unbearable, and smoke was making it hard to breathe. But as Holcomb raised his reloaded weapon, a burning timber fell from the sky, crashing down between them and sending up a shower of sparks. The sheriff had to dive aside to avoid being crushed, and his shot went wide. Chaska seized the moment. Despite his wounds and exhaustion, he lunged forward with his tomahawk raised. The blade caught the firelight as it flew through the air, spinning end over end with deadly accuracy. The tomahawk struck Holcomb in the chest with a wet thud. The sheriff's eyes widened in shock and pain as he looked down at the weapon buried in his body. His gun fell from nerveless fingers, and he took a stumbling step backward. My honor," he whispered, his hand clutching at the tarnished pin on his coat. "My service." "You had no honor," Chaska said quietly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "You never did." Holcomb fell backward across John Mallory's broken grave, his blood seeping into the earth where his victim was buried. The crimson star pin came loose from his coat, falling into the dirt, where it would eventually rust away and be forgotten. Justice had been served, but the price had been high. The fire was all around them now, flames licking at the edges of the graveyard. Chaska staggered toward Annie, his burns making every step agony. The child was still crouched behind her mother's headstone, coughing from the smoke, but otherwise unharmed. "Is he dead?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "Yes," Chaska replied, scooping her up in his arms despite his wounds. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." But they weren't safe yet. The fire had surrounded the graveyard, and the smoke was getting thicker. Chaska could barely see through the haze, and his lungs felt like they were burning with each breath. They needed to find a way out, but the flames seemed to be everywhere. Then he heard voices calling through the smoke, Marshal James Patterson and his men, who had arrived just in time to witness the final confrontation. They had found a path through the flames, a narrow corridor between burning buildings that led to the safety of the creek. "Over here," Chaska shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Patterson appeared through the haze, his face grim with determination. "Come on," he called. "We have to go now." They ran through the burning town, dodging falling timbers and jumping over pools of flame. The heat was incredible, hot enough to blister exposed skin and sear the lungs. But they kept moving, driven by the need to reach safety before the fire consumed everything. As they reached the creek, Chaska collapsed on the muddy bank, his strength finally giving out. Annie was still in his arms, and she was alive. That was all that mattered. The debt he owed to John Mallory had been paid, and the man who had destroyed his family was dead. The weeks that followed were a blur of recovery and revelation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the territory's traveling physician, tended to Chaska's wounds, while Marshal Patterson investigated the full extent of Holcomb's crimes. The conspiracy was even larger than anyone had imagined, involving corrupt officials throughout the territory who had been using their positions to steal land and eliminate anyone who opposed them. The survivors of Bitter Creek, freed from the sheriff's reign of terror, began to see their Indian neighbors in a new light. The man who had once been viewed as a dangerous savage was now recognized as a hero who had saved a child and exposed a murderer. The adoption papers were signed without opposition, and Annie officially became Chaska's daughter. 6 months later, the new town of Mallory Creek was rising from the ashes of the old. The buildings were different now, built with stone foundations and designed to prevent another fire. The people were different too, more willing to work together regardless of the color of their skin. "Tell me about the games again," Annie said one evening as they sat on the porch of their new home. She was learning to speak Lakota, and Chaska was teaching her the skills she would need to survive in both worlds. "Tomorrow, I'll teach you to make a small fire without matches," Chaska said. and I'll show you how to track animals by their footprints. Will you teach me to hunt too? Small game, Chaska said with a smile. Rabbits and birds. Your father would want you to know how to provide for yourself. Annie was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a small wooden carving she had been working on. I made this for you, she said, handing him a rough but recognizable horse. To remember our first ride together. Chaska examined the carving, carefully touched by the child's thoughtfulness. It's beautiful, he said. Your father would be proud of how talented you are. Both of my fathers, Annie corrected, and Chaska felt his heart swell with love and pride. As the stars came out over Mallory Creek, Chaska reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with tears in a graveyard and a promise to honor a friendship. It had led through violence and fire, through loss and revelation, to this quiet evening in a town that represented hope for the future. The crimson star that had once symbolized hatred and violence was buried in the ground, its power broken forever. In its place, a new symbol had emerged, the bond between a Lakota chief and a white child, proof that love could triumph over hatred and that families could be forged by choice rather than blood. The debt to John Mallory had been paid in full, but it had also created something new, a community based on truth instead of lies, and a family united not by blood, but by the courage to do what was right. The story was complete, the circle closed, and in the quiet of the prairie night, justice and mercy had finally found their way home.